I made my cat, whose name is Toaster, the most expensive cat harness in the entire world, and I'm going to show you how I did it. And this video is sponsored by Weaver Leather Supply. It's literally my go-to shop for leatherworking equipment and tools and hand tools. And I'm not just saying that because they sponsored this video. If you watch my shop tour, I showed you like 8 of their machines that we use every single day. So if you want 10% off of their leatherworking site, any item, use the code ROSEANVIL. And basically all the tools I use in this video are from Weaver, and I'll put links in the description and just make a big list of everything I use and everything you'll need for this project. And if you want to do this project at home, I will put another link in the description of how to download the template for free. So now let's get to the making. So if you're doing this at home, you're going to want to practice with some of these cheap foam sheets you can get at any craft store, just so that you can get the sizing right, because the template's not made for every single cat. It's just made for Toaster. And it's basically the same thickness, same consistency, and same everything as leather, so it's just a really cheap way to prototype. Now let's get started with Toaster's harness. This is the biggest piece of shell I've got, and it's not quite big enough. So we're just going to make it a little bit smaller and kind of stretch it and make it work. Then now I'm going to put this little weight down on top to hold the template steady and use my little scratch awl to trace around the perimeter of the template to get a nice crisp line to cut. For the stitching holes, my scratch awl is too big because I didn't cut big enough holes in the acrylic template. And if you're using the paper template, you can use the scratch awl, it'll be fine. But this is just big enough that it'll fit through all the little holes, and so I can mark all my little stitching holes. And now you can see I've got some nice, clean, crisp lines to use as guides for when I cut this out. But before I start cutting, I've got a few more pieces I need to lay out here and trace and get everything lined up for it. Obviously, if you're doing this at home, you're going to be using a paper template, not an acrylic template. It's a lot easier with an acrylic template, so I cut it out on my laser, and I'll put a little video in the corner so you can see how that was done. It's pretty cool process, and it makes it so much easier to make little products like this. And I didn't have enough room on the one piece of Cordovan to make the belly strap, so I had to grab an extra piece and cut it out of this. But if you're using one of the panels from Weaver, you'll have plenty of room to make at least one or two of them. And now it's time to start cutting it out, and I've got my favorite blade here, and Weaver does sell a version of this. It's almost exactly the same, just has a little bit shorter handle, and Weaver's where I buy all my replacement blades for these when I get them too dull to repair. And while I'm getting the rest of these pieces cut out, let's talk a little bit about shell Cordovan and why it's the most expensive leather in the world, or one of the most expensive. And if you don't know, shell Cordovan from Horween costs around $150 per square foot. It's mainly used in shoe production and high-end accessories. One of the best characteristics of it is it doesn't really wrinkle like leather does. It just kind of folds and rolls. And the reason it's $150 a square foot is it only comes from the back portion of the horse's rear. So basically the horse's butt cheeks. And because it only comes from that little area, you can only get 1 or 2 shells per horsehide. And that's a huge part of the reason why it's so expensive. And it also takes several months to tan it because it's not really skin. It's kind of buried deep in the skin. They have to use a special machine to shave down to the actual shell. And like I know a fair amount about shell Cordovan, but I'm still kind of confused on how it all works and why it is the way it is. So one day I want to be able to fly out to Horween and maybe do a factory tour and get a really good understanding of how it's all done. Now that I finally got all the different parts cut out, it's time to start punching all the stitching holes. And I want to use my diamond tip set because I like the way that the stitch lays with these diamond ones, especially on this harness. I wanted to have that kind of weaved look to it. And for you guys who are doing this at home, I'm using my 6mm punches because I set the stitch lengths at 6mm, but you can also just adjust this at home for your own settings and whatever punches you have. I don't even know if anyone's going to be doing this at home, so maybe this information is irrelevant to everybody. But now I got all the holes punched, and I need to run over to my heat press and heat emboss my logo into the little chest plate and into the back piece, but I forgot to film the back piece. Now it's time to make the solid gold hardware, and this was probably the hardest part because I haven't done goldsmithing on a regular basis for quite a while. But it's still really fun to do. And is it a waste of money? Probably, but Toaster deserves it, and I can always melt it down for meltdown value. Unless he escapes with the harness on, and I just lose the $800 or however many dollars worth of gold to the wilderness. And then some lucky person is going to find a skeleton with gold-laden hardware. But anyway, back to actually making this. So basically right now I'm just cutting these pieces into the right size for the D-rings that I'm going to make. And if you're doing this at home, obviously you're probably not going to make them out of gold. So I listed below some D-ring options from Weaver that are solid brass that'll look just as good. So I thought I ordered the gold soft tempered, but it's pretty tough. So I'm just going to have to anneal it with my torch, which basically when you anneal metal, all it does is kind of recirculate the structure of the metal to make it softer, because anytime you bend metal over and over and over, it heats up and it breaks. That's called work hardening the metal, and it basically lines up the structure, creating fault lines and makes it easier to break. But that's not what we want. We want it nice and malleable and not fragile, so that we can form these D-rings without too much hassle. So I ended up making a pretty critical error with these D-rings. I ended up making them too small, so when the belly strap goes through, there's not enough room with the little button snap on there. So eventually I'm going to have to widen them or make them bigger or replace them, because the harness doesn't really work at the end of the day with them too small. And now I'm just making the other D-ring for the other side, and I'm going to try to make it as close to the other one as possible, just by hammering it and pliering it and just kind of manipulating the metal around. And after a minute you can see I'm within reason. And then it's time to make the D-ring for the back for the leash when I take him on walks. That's the real main purpose of this harness, is to be able to take him on walks, and so he gets familiar with wherever he's at. So when he does escape from the shop, he hopefully knows his way back. Now I'm just finishing up closing this little gap so that when I do solder it together, I've got a nice strong joint, and cleaning up the surface so that the solder and the flux flows well. Setting up my little soldering stand, getting it ready for solder, put some flux on there. And any jeweler out there is going to hate how disgusting my soldering joints are, but I'm just heating it up to the temperature where the solder is going to melt. Put it on there just like that. Next D-ring, same thing, dirty flux, heat, put the solder on, flows well enough for a cat harness. And then the third ring, same thing, disgusting flux, a little bit of heat and solder, and good to go. I overheated that one a little bit, but whatever. Now, after I polished a little bit off screen, but I'm finishing up here on my dental lathe. You saw this in the indestructible shoe video, I think, if you watched that one. I use it as a weight because it literally weighs 48 pounds. It's such a nice little dental lathe. I got it for $5 at the local thrift store. What a steal. So got it all polished up. They're looking pretty good. I did a little bit more polishing off screen, but they're pretty much there. Now it's time to start stitching this together. So I put a little foam down so my weight doesn't smash the leather. And I'm going to use some needles from Weaver. We use these literally every single day in the shop. I always buy my needles from Weaver. Same with this thread. And I like that they sell them in these little teeny spools, because this is the Ritza or tiger thread. And it's kind of the industry standard for really high quality thread. And usually you have to buy it in 500 meter spools, and they're like $60. But Weaver sells them in smaller spools, so it's a little bit easier to afford and be able to do smaller projects on. So like if I want a really thin thread or something, I always buy like a little spool from Weaver, just because it's a lot cheaper. And so I'm just doing this little X stitch. I don't really know what the official name for this stitch is. I think it might be called like box stitch or something, but I really like the look of it, and it's really clean and handcrafted look compared to just like a flat stitch or an overlapping stitch. And this is kind of where we got to make up a little bit of room, because I didn't have enough room for the template. So I'll just kind of leave a little bit of extra slack in the thread so that the belly strap will slide through just fine. And then burn the ends off and start working on the little breastplate, a little chest piece. But first I'm going to burnish it with a little Tokonol to make it nice and clean, because I won't be able to burnish this once it's all together. And Tokonol is my favorite burnishing compound. I've done the gum tragacanth and beeswax. Tokonol, it almost has kind of like an Elmer's glue consistency, and it gives you a really nice clean shine compared to some of the other ones. Like beeswax is cool if you want some waterproofness, but it doesn't give you quite as good of a shine. But now we got this pretty much all the way sewn on. I'm going to finish tying it up, cut it off, and burn the ends. And because it's going on Toaster's chest, I'm going to just take the back of the knife and hammer it down nice and flat. And now we've got our branded chest plate and our little box stitch, or whatever you call it. Now I'm going to start burnishing up the back piece that holds on the D-ring, putting some more Tokonol on there, and just going to do a little hand burnishing on it. I could get a better burnish on my machine, but I thought for this video it'd be cool just to show you guys some hand burnishing for a change. And Weaver sells a little tool like this. I don't remember even where I got this one. This might be another hand-me-down tool, but there's a lot of burnishers out there. They're hand burnishers. Just make sure you get a hardwood one because they make a big difference. Now that we got everything burnished up, I'm going to start stitching everything together. And I usually do 3 to 4 times the total length of the stitch in thread. And if you're doing this at home, make sure you pay attention to how I'm actually stitching this together, because there's a certain way you've got to stitch it. So you see I started at the top right corner, stitch down, put on my little D-ring, then stitch those 3 layers together, locking on the D-ring, continue stitching across till I get to the other D-ring, put the other D-ring on, and then stitch all those 3 layers together. And then I'm going to move the stitch up the side of the piece. And then before I start stitching it down, I'll put the big D-ring on and then stitch the remaining corner on. Stitch that way across, finishing up the stitch. And usually what you'd want to do is back stitch it. But because I want a really clean look without any doubled up stitching, I'm just going to tie it and burn it, because there's not going to be a whole lot of pressure on this ever. So it'll be strong enough, with the burned edges and hammering it down, should be just fine. Now we've got most of it stitched together. I think it's turning out really good. I'm really happy with how it's looking. Now it's time to finish up the belly strap. So I'm going to start punching the holes with my little rotary punch. I'm going to punch a smaller hole for the screw and the little button stud on each end. And then the 3 remaining holes, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger so that the button sits in there nicely without deforming the strap and without making it too bulged. And then I'm going to cut little slits so it makes it easier to pop through. And once I've got those made, all I've got to do is thread it through and just double check that everything's going to line up correctly and make sure it all looks good. And then it's time to make the gold capped button studs. And to make these, I'm just going to take a brass button stud from Weaver and cut the top off. And I would have liked to have made the entire thing out of solid gold, but then I would have to have the little screw machined and the inside machined. So I'm just going to use some leftover gold from a previous ring project and cut a little square section off with my blade or my jeweler's saw, and cut a second matching one. And I wanted to make kind of like a faceted top to the button stud. So I just used my file and slowly worked in and played with it a little bit until I was happy with having that faceted square look to it. And then I'm just going to file the tops of the screws flat, put some solder on it, throw some heat on it again. And this time I was struggling with the shakes. I had too much caffeine, so I had to sneak up the solder from the bottom and rest it against there and do my best to get the solder to flow there. And you can see it flowed just fine. And I overheated it just a little bit and kind of warped it, but for the most part, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And then I threw it in the pickle for a while off screen, got some of the oxidation and the flux off of there, took some sandpaper to it to clean the rest of it off. And then off screen again, I put it on my dental lathe and cleaned it up to make them look nice and shiny. And then I had just screwed them onto the strap and got them all tightened down. And this is where I realized I made my mistake, because when I tried to install the strap onto the harness and realized I wouldn't be able to do it without unscrewing the button studs every single time. But whatever, it'll still work. I'll just have to screw it on Toaster every single time I put him on him. But get those tightened down, pop them through, make sure everything fits fine, and the harness is basically done. And I'm just going to go over the other edges that I haven't burnished yet. I should have burnished these beforehand, but I thought that it'd keep a better edge if I burnished them at the end. But then I later realized that it's hard to get some of the corners when you burnish it when it's all together. But whatever, live and learn. Make bigger D-rings, burnish before you put it together. Now we know, it's fine. But I really love how Cordovan burnishes up. It really brings out the shine in the leather, and it looks so good. I love it so much. And that would have been the end of the project, but after looking at it, I didn't quite have as much flash and flare as I wanted to. So my girlfriend let me take one of her 18 karat gold bracelets that was too big for her and remove the jump ring and just take a couple inches out of it so we can make a little necklace for Toaster, a little something extra on top of this harness. So I got a couple solid gold jump rings, and that's how I'm going to attach it. So all I need to do is take my little rotary punch a couple little holes on either side of the little breastplate thing, and open up those jump rings, thread them into each of the holes, and then grab that little bit of chain that I cut off, thread it onto the jump ring, and then just close up those jump rings. And that looks so much better. The last thing I got to do is just clean up the leather. You know, I've got a little bit of tokenol on it here and there, a few scratches from moving around and struggling over the last week to get this project finished. But there we have it. I think it turned out really good. And really the only thing left we've got to do is get it on toaster. And this was a struggle to say the least. Once it's around his neck and he kind of pushes his head through, he doesn't have as big of an issue with it. But it's still kind of a struggle getting it on him, especially when I was trying to get this screw that button stud on instead of just pushing it through. But after a little bit of struggling, I finally got it on him, and it was time for Toaster's close-ups, some action shots of him in the harness, some glamour shots. So now the harness is done, how much would it cost you to go out and buy a harness like this? Well, I used about $950 worth of 14 karat, 18 karat in the chain gold. I used about $175 worth of the shell Cordovan. And it would take me about 8 hours to redo this with hand cutting, hand stitching, and hand making all of the hardware. And so that brings a total to $1,280, and that's just the cost. So the minimum you'd be paying just to cover someone's labor would be over $1,200. If you double it, which most companies would do to cover the cost of product development, running a business, rent, and all the overhead of a business, it'd be over $2,500. And for a luxury item that usually have like 4 to 5 times markup, you'd be spending over $5,000 on a cat harness. So I'm pretty sure this is the most expensive harness in the world. If I were to sell it at luxury markup, or even at cost, it'd probably be the most expensive cat harness in the world. And obviously I would never sell it for $5 grand, but I could see someone doing it. Don't forget, if you do want to do this project at home and make one yourself, you can get 10% off anything off weaverleathersupply.com. And I made a huge list in the description of all the tools and everything you're going to need to do it at home. And thanks for everything you guys do. And I hope you enjoyed this. Hopefully you made it to the end, and see ya.